laundry.
Mm.
Oh.
Okay, we're live. So, welcome to Dive into Worldbuilding, and today we're talking about illnesses and ailments and medicine and things of that variety in world building. And this is a topic that we've talked about before, but you know, whenever you talk about something, you talk about different stuff. So, it has been a long time since we spoke about illnesses and medicine. So, I think this will be very cool. um, and I will remark as we start that I just don't think people do nearly enough with illnesses and medicine in fiction. I mean, you're either there's nothing wrong with anybody, or there's a plague that's killing everyone.
Yeah.
And there's not a ton in between. You know, you might have somebody who's got a limp, or somebody with a quaint detail, but there is not a ton of well, I just don't feel like there's a ton going on in the area of illnesses and medicine. Just the way that they are. Well, I'm not going to say the way they are in our world, but like everybody's got something going on, right?
Yeah.
Why does nobody ever catch a cold while on a quest?
Then there's talk about the sewage in the street.
Well, exactly. It's sort of like that's not necessarily relevant because that would be kind of gross or whatever.
I read one Glenn Cook. He had that fantasy PI where he had and it was either like a really bad cold or like the flu for like the entire book. He was like dragging himself around. But I still feel like he did way too much because even with, if you have the flu, you're gone, you're dead. You're like dead to the world for like a week or whatever, however long it takes. And so he's still like dragging himself around doing stuff. But I'm just like, go home and go to bed. But I mean, that would be a boring book.
Well, then nothing would happen, right?
I know. So that's the only instance I can think of where like the character has just had like a sort of temporary, has been sick during, well, they have had to go out and still do their job.
Yeah.
See, but that's really realistic, though, because, I mean, I just had my face explode, right? And I had to go to work.
Yeah. We got to deal with it, You just...
Like, stay home, you're infecting everyone. I mean, not in your case. Like...
here's the thing. I'm thinking about this aspect, this issue of having to deal with it, go do things anyway. Well, I read a book one time where the main character got injured all the time. And it was incredibly too much. Like, she was getting, bleeding and having to tie it up. And then, but it was like, by the time she got done with the story, you were like, and I'm not talking about the author here. The author is not, was not a woman to my knowledge. But by the time you got to the story, this female main character was so beat up that you're like, I don't think you would still be functional. She's having to splint her broken wrist at various points. And you're like, what? I mean, so how do you handle it in such a way that it's actually, I don't know. I mean, does it have to be part of the plot, like majorly plot influencing to be worth the trouble? Or what exactly? Because it can be overdone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I think that's the thing, and I think what it comes down to when you're talking about like minor illnesses that pop up is it would have to be it goes back to something else, and I keep quoting Chuck Wendig because I read his blog so much, but about consequences. Like you know, if you punch someone, there should be a bruise, right? Or like if you come into contact with the virus, then there should be either character concern that they're going to be sick, or they actually get sick.
I agree. The consequences idea is really important.
Yeah. And I think that that's important in terms of world building for making your world realistic and believable, because, you know, everybody's talking about Ebola. It's nowhere near me in my region, but, you know, we're all thinking about it, right?
Right. I just shared an article this morning about how death is cheapened and grief is cheapened in stories, because the sense that these things have consequences is not nearly well enough explored.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't mean to veer us onto the subject of death, because I think that's a whole different hour.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I think there is a good argument for making it plot related, in as much as it's worth having something happen that would affect our ability to be, you know, to get our job done as main characters, right? And another, so, you know, there's also the disability side of this, which is another whole hour. We're sort of in a little pocket of topic here.
Yeah.
But I do notice that, you know, people always make these hairbreadth escapes without any kind of injury whatsoever, and you know, and unless everybody's dying from the plague, as I said, nothing's going on with illness. I had to think about that when I was working on For Love for Power, because one of the characteristics of the noble cast is that everybody's inbred, and so everybody has somebody sick in their family. And so I had to make sure that as you went around and met noble people, that they would have funny things wrong with them, right? So, you know, I've got a guy who's got hyperthyroidism and another fellow who's got a heart defect, and those guys are actually functional and engaged in the political process because their problems are not severe enough to make it so that they have to bow out of civilized society. But then at the same time, you've got all these people who are actually hidden within this group because they have, you know, other problems like Williams syndrome. One of the characters has Williams syndrome, and you know, there are other characters who are just not capable of operating in such a way that they're what they call defective qualities, and this is a slur that is used by the nobility to talk about these people. It's not me trying to cast aspersions. I try to problematize that, in fact, in the story. It's so they basically people get hidden a lot if they've got health problems, but at the same time there are so many health problems that everybody kind of has at least one in their family, and so you can't hide everybody. So there are still these people who have to be around, and you kind of go, oh well, you know. But it's funny because then you start walking around and you go, you know, you see the people who look ostensibly healthy. You're like, well, what's their problem? You know, and that's kind of what I'd like people to be doing. Is like, well, wow, maybe they have a problem that nobody knows about. Yeah. I think it would be interesting to have characters. I mean, there in real life books. You know, I'm thinking of Little Women. There are people who get sick and die and you know, have weak constitutions and stuff like that. It's just less common, I guess, in fiction. because usually we've got a big task for people to get done. You know.
I think that's, yeah, in particular genre fiction.
Yeah.
Is because it's like sort of there's always something like bigger going on, and do you really have time to stop for scarlet fever? You know, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, the whole party gets sick with yellow fever in a swamp, and action halts.
Well, you know, so okay,
die.
that's actually a really good. That's a really good one. Yellow fever for all. Woohoo!
Yeah.
But actually, to go back to my novel for just a second, if you'll forgive me, my main character gets the thing. There is also a thing. In addition to all these illnesses that people just have in a hereditary sense, there's also a sort of flu-like plague going around, right? It's not really a plague. It's you know, plague. You think of lesions and whatever. This is a thing that is like the flu for people who are not in the nobility. But if you're in the nobility, you tend to contract it and then get anaphylaxis and die.
Red.
So my main character gets this, and it completely changes the course of the plot because all of a sudden he's not capable of doing anything, and that's the whole point. But meanwhile, there are two other point of view characters who are still capable of doing things, right?
Yeah.
And so part of the whole point of having him get sick is, well, when he gets sick, the world doesn't just stop for him, right? And all of a sudden, the task that he has in front of him is very, very different. So, you know, I think that's kind of interesting, which is why I did it, you know. I don't know. Other things that people don't do enough, dental problems.
Everyone has good
Oh, yeah.
Vision problems, right? You know, auditory problems. Nobody wants to brush their teeth on Quest.
Well, you see, like, you know, I mean, people have
That's
glasses.
unfortunate.
You know, you see glasses.
So let's do. Everybody's sort of piling in on the chat bar here, so I'm going to try and pick up just a little bit. Whoa! All right. Alex, who is I think only on chat bar, says he likes exploring illness and ailments because he's a cancer survivor, and yeah, it does tend to steal spotlight from the plot unless you make it part of the plot, which I think also works. It doesn't necessarily have to be a story focused essentially on a fight against cancer or on a fight against a particular disease in order for the disease to be able to play a meaningful part in the plot. So thank you for that contribution. And then we have Pat asking after healers, midwives, and shamans. Where are they?
I just think that it would be very rare for people to try and treat themselves for serious injuries.
Right.
And
That's
if they
a good
did,
point,
they have a
Matt.
good outcome, so no one would ever hear about it.
Yeah.
It's one thing if you've got a traveling party, but if you're in a settled location.
Yeah.
There's always like some kind of town doctor.
Well, you would think, right?
And,
I
well,
mean, the people who lived in the town would have somebody they went to if they had problems, and they're gonna have problems. This is life.
and I'm sure there must be some books that center on the healers or doctors or something.
Well, I'm gonna
Grass.
recommend actually, because I love this book. Well, the trilogy, The Healing Wars, Janice Hardy.
Oh, I've heard of those. Yeah.
It's really fun because the whole thing centers on the role of healers in this society, and the role of healers is actually intimately connected with the role of soldiers, which is in this fascinating and sort of sick way. And it's really, really fun. So she's basically got magical healing, which is the only kind of magic in the world, in this world. And what you do is when you basically lay hands on somebody as a healer and you magically heal them, but as you do it, the pain of their injury comes into your body. And then you have to get rid of it somehow, otherwise it will slowly kill you. And so the way that you get rid of it is typically by putting it into a magical metal. And then that magical metal can be enchanted so that it shoots pain at people.
Nice.
So it's feeding the war at the same time that it's helping the injured, and it's really fascinating. Not enough, exactly, not enough is usually done with healing. So that's why it's worth taking a look at what Janice did with that, because it's awesome. And the main character basically can't, healers are highly valued in the society, as you might imagine, but the main character can't get a job because she can't put pain into the metal. She can only put it into other people. This leads to complications.
I can think of something I'd like to do.
Alexander, thanks for that. Yeah, I'm a huge fan, obviously. I helped her with the early drafts of this book, but my kids have been reading it, and it's just really, really fun. So, now you do have like hedge witches sometimes, where you get, somebody who's providing little potions and this, that, and the others for people in the village. You do
Cameron
see
Hurley's Beldame Apocrypha uses hedge witches. Actually, there's quite a bit about injury and healing in that because of the nature of the world building in that.
Say the name of it again.
Cameron Hurley's Beldame Apocrypha.
Okay.
There's an awful lot, and because you're talking about like a war-torn society, and the group that she focuses on in the narrative, or this group of mercenaries called the Beldames, there's a lot of sort of like the organic, I would call it organic tech, that has to do with the body, like. So one of the big phrases in the book is Beldames are hard to kill, and it's because when you become a Beldame, there's an insect that's inserted into your brain that if you do, for whatever reason, die in the course of doing your job as an assassin, a mercenary, this bug excretes a juice or something that can bring the person back to life as long as you have the appropriate set of healers available.
Oh, interesting.
So there's that, but then you also have hedge witches, which are kind of like freelancers who, if you kind of have to be off the grid and you need something to help you get through to mend yourself, you would go to a hedge witch in Cameron Hurley's world.
Cool. Sounds really neat.
Yeah. So there's a lot.
Sorry?
I just said there's a lot of interesting stuff about this topic in that book. I didn't even think about it until just now, and I love those books.
That's great. What were you going to say, Glenda, about Dream Snake?
It's about a healer. I'm not sure whether it's a secondary world or a post-apocalyptic world, but has these 3 genetically modified snakes that she can use. The snake venom cures various illnesses, and so she travels from village to village. Well, 2 of the snakes heal, and the third one is basically gives a peaceful death.
I see.
Someone she can't heal. And I don't remember who wrote it. Maybe Dr. McIntyre.
Donna McIntyre, yeah.
And,
It won a Hugo as a novella, and then it won, I think, again for the novel.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's what threw me off at first. I was remembering the novella title because they changed the title when it became a novel.
Yeah.
Post travel, everyone had left Earth. a lot of people, and what was left was kind of medieval in technology, but some
Yeah.
things were really modern. The snake itself was alien, that's why they couldn't figure it out. It needed to
Ah.
reproduce in threes instead of twos.
Huh.
Interesting.
That's really cool.
It is really cool. So, yeah. So, okay. So let's go with a new topic that I just thought of, which is first aid kits.
Ah.
Um, First aid kits in our world were actually invented by Clara Barton um, back when she was kicked out of the Red Cross in like 1904 or something like that. Basically, she ran the U.S. Red Cross. She started it coming out of the Civil War and the Franco-Prussian War, and she was totally amazing. I've written actually a blog post about her because we went to her house, and it was so amazing just to learn about what she did. I mean, this woman was completely Herculean. But at a certain point, the men involved in the Red Cross U.S. Decided that they didn't want their organization run by women. Great. And so they kicked her out. I mean, she was like in her 80s at the time, but at the same time, I mean, gee, she was still able to do a lot of things, and she just basically decided to go off and prove it by starting the first aid organization in the U.S. after she'd been kicked out of the Red Cross in her 80s. And so if you have a first aid kit, you owe it to Clara Barton, basically. She was the one who came up with the idea that the Red Cross should operate during peacetime for natural disasters and such.
Yeah.
Which is a pretty good idea. So, so my point being that first aid kits are actually a pretty modern thing. The idea that you would carry around a set of particular things to help you with injuries, etc. And I don't know. It's like, do we have the Clara Bartons of the fictional world, or do we? You know, you don't run across that a whole great deal. Usually, people are, I don't know, ripping their clothes.
Yeah.
That in those days, most people would have traveled around with at least a bottle of ointment.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were things that people did that were actually counterproductive. Do you
Oh
know what
yeah,
mummy?
like giving people mercury. Oh Lord.
The King of France used to ride around with a little flask of powdered mummia tied to his saddle horn. What it was ground up mummy from Egypt, and you were supposed to take sniffs of it, and it would hold off the plague.
Oh,
Except
wow.
that after they
Wow.
ran out of mummies, they started digging up or grabbing random bodies and turning them into mummies and grinding them up. And some of them had actually died of the plague in the first place. So this was counterproductive. And it wound up with Marseille being the center in France where all this stuff was produced. And they built an entire hedge around Marseille to keep people from leaving because they were passing this stuff out, and they had strange outbreaks of plague in the wintertime, which is kind of counter to the natural history of the whole thing. It was really bizarre.
Wow.
Oh dear. Yeah, well, I mean, I think the fact that people don't really know what's going to help a lot of times is a good point, and something that would be really interesting to explore in a story at some point.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of miasmas and the early concepts of where different humors were in the body. You know, the function of the organs before people actually knew what the functions of the organs were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you still see weird treatments today. I mean, people, like, despite science, believe all sorts of things.
Yes.
Yes.
Um,
Well, okay, Inspector's End, I'll bite. Inspector's End, which is the first of a trilogy that I'm working on with my friend Devin. It is a post-apocalyptic future dystopia fantasy.
Wow.
History of magic in the world. But there's a couple of things in terms that deal with directly with illness. And one is that each village in the story has a healer. Every family that has a homestead has a specific set of herbs like that you would just have in your home in case of some of the more common ailments like cuts, colds, fungal infections, things that are recognizable. But when it's not recognizable and you can't do it yourself, you call upon the healer in the village. And the healer has special skill set and special knowledge. And so you have this infrastructure set up that is kind of talked about but not very much. Like it's kind of in the background until the healer becomes really important in the plot of the story. And at one point there is a girl who falls ill, and it's a mysterious illness, and she's basically in like sort of a catatonic state. Nobody knows why. Now there is another whole big plot that will take me too long to explain about the why, but the healer is called in. This particular illness has a very large part in the story and the plot, but in terms of the world building, to get to that plot, you do have to know a little bit about the world in terms of the way they treat illnesses, and but it's interwoven. All this stuff is interwoven with like 3 different plot threads going on with the book.
Sure.
And of course, you've got character development, origin stories about like, okay, how this healer is so good at what she does, and like why this particular person illness is so integral, and all that stuff. But it's kind of interesting, and it's in terms of world building, and you talk about illness and the healing stuff, and if you're going to use magic or something that might conceivably come from consensus reality. And I have both of those things in play. The village healer needs to draw from her environment. So there's things like herbs and potions and powders that she pulls out of her garden. And it's knowledge that has come down through her family. But then you also have people who can wield different kinds of magic. Some of it heals, but it's always very specific. But if you lose the person who uses that magic, you lose the entire benefit of that. Like it's gone because the magic is unpredictable in this world.
Right.
Well, if you want to talk about fiction, something that has to do with capgras delusion. That's the delusion you can get when you have an injury to the circuit in the brain that connects what you feel about a person with recognizing them. And when you don't feel that, you tend to think they're an imposter. And sometimes you react really badly. Because there's no good reason for pretending to be someone you're not, like your dad or your husband or your wife.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so bad it can be like your poodle is an imposter, your sofa. So I wanted to design an engineered virus that would cause encephalitis to cause that specific injury. The paranoia plague.
Ooh.
Because if you ramp up the certain levels of adrenaline in the brain and you ramp down the oxytocin, so you have less reason to trust people, I think you could really generate some fiery paranoia. And if everybody had it, how in the hell do you do anything?
Yeah.
The only people you can work with are the people that you don't trust in the first place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
But it's complicated, so I'm not getting very far very fast.
Oh.
Well, I mean, yeah, it takes a lot of thinking through to figure out what the consequences are going to be, right? Because that's what you've got there is pretty huge. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted it to be a story, but it's always outgrown that from day one. Now it wants to be a novel, so.
Yeah. Don't you hate that? Like, sometimes the idea that you think is going to be a short story, it's like, oh, wait, this is way too big for how I want to do it, you know? That
And
happens.
also, Alex is making a little bit of a side point here. He's got a piece where he's got a nobility that uses biological nanomachines, and then the rest of the population is on its own because they can't help them. And what I'm finding interesting about that, aside from just the idea, is the idea of healthcare resources and scarcity, because that's a huge factor in our world.
Yes.
Who gets the good care and why?
The ones with money,
Yeah.
for the most part. Because if you have money, then you can buy everything you need. You can buy the best doctors, go to the best hospitals, you know, get the newest, cutting-edge, most expensive treatment for
Right.
Even in a lower tech herbalist type environment, you can import the rare healing herb from the other side of the world.
Right.
It doesn't grow locally.
Actually, that's something that you see in fairy tales a few times, is that, you know, the queen who falls ill and needs this very rare thing in order to be healed. We see that sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, and the other thing, so I'm also thinking about why people wouldn't want health care. Because there's, I think, this kind of view, at least I see it around in our society, well, why aren't these people going to the hospital when they need to? And there are lots of social issues, like, you know, if you can't trust the people there to take care of you, then why would you go? Right?
Medical incompetence.
Well, incompetence, but I'm also thinking about racism
Yeah.
and classism and yeah, you've just come from Africa, but you don't have health insurance, so you have 103 fever, go home.
Yeah.
You know, kind of thing. And there's also, we've seen, at least in California with the Proposition 187 some years ago, that it was like, well, we don't want to have to treat illegal immigrants and spend money on them, and so we're just not going to. Where there's this seeming disconnect from the idea that if everybody around you is healthy, that's a good thing. And, you know, some diseases are contagious, and having lots of sick people in your society pulls your society down as a whole, right? Your herd immunity is good, as Alexander says. Yeah. So.
And also, do you want the person who's serving your food and making your sandwich to be sick?
Yes. You know, so Pat's saying, do you incur a possibly unpleasant obligation or relationship? Yeah. Definitely that's a factor as well.
Well, we've just finished paying my mother's medical debts after 8 years.
Oh,
Oh my gosh.
And
well
in
done.
societies,
But
it could be much worse than that.
yeah.
Think about Rwanda, where they have the Ubahaki clientship relationship. You could get in trouble politically with certain people like the chief of the land or the chief of the grass under the old-style management system. And you could go to the third guy, the chief of the armies, for help, but then you would owe him a debt, and you would be working for him part of the time for the rest of your life. He owed you protection after that once you became his client. but you owe him a whole lot more, especially in
Right.
time.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, I think in the modern Western world, in terms of healthcare costs, the cost, even with insurance, can sometimes be really prohibitive. My dog bite took me 6 months. I had a dog bite. I went to the emergency room, and it took me 6 months to pay it off because I don't make a lot of money.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because there is that, like, unless something is actually rotting off, you don't go to the doctor because it's too much money.
Yeah.
I mean, if something is horrific, then you go. Otherwise, you know, as long as nothing's falling off, you're fine.
Yeah, so then your illnesses in your world building would also have an impact on the economics in your world building, especially if we're looking at something analogous to our current healthcare model.
Yep.
It's even harder if you're dealing with a mental illness,
Yeah, mental
because
illness.
most
We don't deal with that enough.
companies try to slide out of that one entirely, where they'll greatly limit the care to the point where it does no good anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, like, the access to, like, the drugs, you need to treat it. Especially if they're, like one of, like, the really sort of controlled substances, like, because I guess you could sell it on the street for, like, huge quantities of money or something, and so they're like, oh no, you only get 5 pills this month, even though you need, like, 50 or something, it's...
Oh, geez, yeah. Well, and then there's, as we go further and further into this topic, there's also, abuse of medicines, like, abuse of prescribed painkillers and stuff that we see in our world, right?
Yeah.
And House had that because it was set in our world, but I have not seen a lot of that, I mean, I did the Cold Words had a drug addicted character, and it was for reasons that had to do with the plot. And I think Sheila Finch has done a character who was addicted to drugs, and that was not for reasons having to do with plot, but it affected the plot. But I actually haven't seen, unless we're setting it in the real world, I haven't seen a whole heck of a lot of that.
Stacia Kane has a whole series where the main character just pops pills, like, just candy. And I guess, like, yeah, I think you see more abuse of, like, alcohol, I think, in fantasy.
Yes.
Because it's, like, I think everybody sort of go to. And maybe, like, some opium or something.
Yeah, I've seen opium before. Yeah. And Pat. Oh, that's right. Okay, so more coming out of the chat bar here. Pat's mentioning a river in Ireland where people took madmen, people with difficulty in the mental illness department, because the river water was laced with lithium, which is actually used as a medicine for some mental illnesses. So that's very interesting. And then Alexander mentions that you often hear about laudanum in fantasy.
Yeah.
Probably, especially, I would guess. I haven't read a lot, but because it was like the go-to Victorian medicine.
Yeah.
Well,
laudanum is so divorced from our notion of modern medicine. I think it's, like, kind of a fun thing to play with.
Yeah.
In fantasy,
Well, there was a time when chloroform was like this big thing, right? I mean, if you've ever read Tintin, everybody's always getting chloroform clapped over their nose and mouth. Like, everybody gets kidnapped several times using chloroform. You start wondering if it's going to affect their brain.
Yeah, it shows.
But yeah,
Yeah.
I think that has to do with when it was written. But
Yeah.
it is interesting.
Well, it was
Oh my.
also like the first real anesthetic.
Oh,
And
the
it's
other one I've seen in Tintin is quinine.
Yeah.
But there was also, Tintin in particular had at least one large plot thing designed around a sort of a something that like a madness serum where people with blowguns would like shoot you with a dart from outside the window and hit you in the neck, and then you would go Lulu, and then and nobody could ever get you back again, and it was like whoo. um,
God.
I don't think that was super realistic, but it was still a major plot point for the, for the story, and it was very freaky. You're like, oh no, not him, So it is very interesting.
Some herbs have been around for a very long time. Poppy
Yeah.
seeds have actually been used since Roman days.
Yes.
Yes. And then willow bark too.
Yeah.
Yes, for fever.
Mm-hmm.
There were certainly drugs used by midwives for a number of things to stop bleeding or to encourage it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the whole wide world of poisons.
Yeah.
Fun. um, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you know what else in world building? I'm thinking now in terms of plot points, or like with or in treatments of illnesses, things that you think are, I mean, because historically this has happened, things that you think are beneficial but turn out to be the opposite. Like at what point, like seeing something where somewhere along this healing journey, I guess, like, in a cultural context in your world building, like seeing the drama around the moment that physicians start to understand that this thing that they've thought forever that was beneficial is not.
Mm-hmm.
And they're
Oh,
seeing,
yeah.
you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's a TV show, The Nick. I don't have Cinemax, so I haven't watched it, but it's about early, like, Victorian doctors actually figuring things out.
Oh,
Um, so, yeah, it'll be on DVD soon enough, presumably.
Netflix.
Yes,
Well, I
Nick.
mean, I think actually scientific discoveries are really, really cool and a fun thing to put in stories. So, you know, um, the Healing Wars actually has like uh, illicit experimentation on people with healing powers that ends up sort of forcing them, basically ends up forcing them to develop various different types of talents that people didn't know it was possible for you to have, and and but it was partly due to the fact that they were loading them up with so much pain that their talents kind of morphed, and it was like, oh, this is creepy. It was a little bit sort of Nazi-ish in ways. Um, Medical experimentation is kind of cool and also kind of freaky. Um, I mean, there's been a lot of medical experimentation on aliens and mermaids and things in stories, right?
Yeah.
I was also thinking again in talking about some of these herbs that have been known from ancient times that do have real effects, the dosage issues.
Oh, yeah.
Because the same thing that may be beneficial at one dose could be very harmful at a higher dose.
Yep.
Yeah, what's that stuff they use for dropsy? It's a plant extract. It causes the symptoms that it treats. So if you accidentally picked the right victim and you gave them overdoses of the stuff, it would look like they actually had dropsy.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's been used in a couple of modern murder plots. There was one in Oakland where they took people who were getting their Social Security checks and they started dusting their food with this stuff. It comes from the flower foxglove.
Okay.
Alice?
And the normal autopsy doesn't distinguish between the two synthetic forms and the natural forms. So what they're trying to do is induce dropsy, get these people to die of heart attacks, and collect their Social Security checks after they bury them somewhere.
Wow.
Mm.
I actually have a nonfiction book which I haven't read yet. All about it was the 1920s where they started figuring out how to, in autopsy, find out if they were poisoned, if people were poisoned or not.
Mm.
Before that, it was kind of poison was a free-for-all because you couldn't, like, the best you could do is maybe feed the poisoned food to a dog if there was anything left and see if it died.
Yeah.
So it was not an easy conviction.
Or if it was a poison that would have left like an obvious
Right.
physical side
But
effect.
if it wasn't obvious, it was like, you didn't know, and so it's about them actually figuring it out. I actually have it over there on my shelf. I think it's called The Poisoner's Handbook, but I'm not 100% on that. I'd have to get up and get it. Yeah. So apparently it wasn't until the 20s that you could actually catch a poisoner with conclusive scientific proof.
Yeah.
I think she wrote about that because she was actually a pharmacist during World War I. And then when she started writing mystery novels, she started with a poison. The Mysterious Affair at Styles, I think it was.
Cool.
Although in fantasies you have the drinking cups made of the magical unicorn's horn that will turn black if the poisoned wine is poured in it.
Yeah, it's sort of like
a lot more of the local taster.
Yeah.
Taster. Now there would be a nerve-wracking job.
Oh God, I know, seriously, huh?
There were kings who gave themselves low doses of known poisons in order to build up a tolerance for it so that they wouldn't be taken down by a large dose.
Interesting.
That's like people who inject themselves with snake venom to build up immunity.
Well, you know what? This really is getting me to be thinking about not just, well, we need to have a more realistic portrayal that yes, people actually do get sick and stuff like that, but also the practices, the cultural practices surrounding medicine and health beliefs and all that kind of stuff is so fascinating. There's a ton of potential there.
Yeah.
You're sneezing, you're ejecting a demon, right?
Yeah.
I almost wonder though, because it's like, how much knowledge would you have to have? I think maybe writers keep away from it because they don't have like the medical background to like go into it. And for science fiction, you can make up like the nano machines that'll fix everything, or like, like the scan bed that will reanatomize you and clear you. Like Elysium, if you saw that movie, they had like this bed where you would lie down and it would fix anything. Like it would just completely remove it. All you had to do was like lie on this bed thing and it would go over and it would remove anything, cancer, leukemia, anything. And it was only the rich people on the space station of Elysium that had these things, and it was central to the plot. So I think you have sort of an ease of fixing things in science fiction and fantasy, where you can just make stuff up. But then if you don't want to just make stuff up, you have to go know some stuff about medicine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I agree. It does take research, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of thinking, too. Because especially if you're making up cultural practices for a world that is not our own world, the consequences of changing a thing are in general a lot larger than one might think they would be.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah.
I mean, when I work with the VAR and caste system, I'm always thinking to myself, okay, as I walk into XYZ situation, which caste does each person involved in the interaction actually belong to, and why?
Yeah.
And what does that do about how they, how does that change how they interact with other people in the interaction? And it's just like everywhere. It's stupid little things like, okay, how does a pharmacy work? Or, like, okay, and now we're going to go shopping, and what does this involve? And actually, what's in the store, and how is the store organized, and what's its clientele? Is it,
Yeah.
So the point being that if you were to change something about medical practices, you don't actually know necessarily going in how far the consequences of that are going to spread. But ideally, I think that one should be able to think through and say, well, it's going to make this kind of a change in the way people talk about illness or the way that people think about what to do when they feel sick, etc. Because I find those little differences fascinating, and it's always fun to run across them in fiction.
Yeah.
So anyway, we are at 12 o'clock, so I think we're going to wrap up here, but thank you, everybody. This has been really interesting, and I don't think it bore a whole lot of resemblance to our previous conversation about the same topic. So,
Good.
I just think it just depends on who's talking and who's there and whatever. I believe, Alexander, great to have you. And I think next week's topic was we were going to do economics.
Yeah.
Because we haven't done that one in a really long time, and it's hugely important because if you don't have your economics worked out, then your world is going to come across as a bit flimsy. So,
How to embrace things in a fantasy universe.
well, it's like I think sometimes people fall into the trap of, well, this is fantasy, so I can just it just works, how I want it to work. But at the same time, I've also seen the argument that when you leave the real world, you are actually more accountable in some ways to the way things are supposed to work because you have to have a basis from which people are willing to suspend their disbelief. So, anyway, awesome, and we will hopefully see you next week. And I'm going to terminate on the broadcast.